Welcome everybody to our special education series. Today's the focus of disciplinary consequences for students with disabilities. I want to let you know that the webinar is being recorded and we will post the video and the resources mentioned at SANES.org soon. For questions, we've got everybody muted upon entry because it is a large crowd. So if you could do the questions in Q&A, our presenter will take breaks periodically questions to make it interactive. So with that, I will turn it over to our Director of Professional Learning, Karen Bronson. Karen?
Thanks so much, Michelle, and welcome everybody. As Michelle said, I know people will be coming in. We had a very large number of registrations for this session today, which tells us what a necessary topic it is. So I know that we're going to be in really great hands with our presenter today. I am very, very happy that Dr. Lynn Helman is here with us. Lynn has been one of the SANES member practitioners who has been instrumental in growing the professional learning opportunities that we have provided over the past year and a half now with regard to special education, especially, but not only, but especially for our school leaders who may not have special ed backgrounds themselves and are placed in administrative positions where they're faced with a lot of challenges and sometimes misunderstandings about ways to work with different special education population, family, staff, you name it. So there's so much to learn in this area, and Lynn has really been particularly helpful in kind of helping us get along to this point. So I'm very glad she's here. Lynn is an educational consultant, an advisor, and an advocate who specializes in special education and literacy. She is the co-president of NYCASE, the New York Council for Administrators of Special Education, NYCASE. And Lynn is also currently the Director of Special Education at Leroy Central School. So I just want to welcome Lynn. Thank you so much for being here on this topic, which has gotten much more kind of complex over the past few years for reasons that you will kind of share with us. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and I'm honored by the number of people who have signed up. So I'll start by saying I am not an attorney, and there are some situations that may need the guidance from your local special education attorneys to work through. So what I'm sharing is basically regulatory and some of the practices that I have put into place with the support of colleagues over the last 15 years of being a special education administrator. So I will share some of those with you and some resources that I look to quite frequently. And I will stop throughout the presentation to allow people to ask questions because it is an ever-changing and complex regulatory system that we have for our discipline for our students with disabilities. And so this is kind of what the agenda of what I want to cover. We'll start with very brief regulatory requirements, just what guides all of the decisions we make around discipline for our kiddos with disabilities, some ideas for prevention, some processes that really can help if they're in place, the paperwork requirements, and then partnerships and resources. So we'll work through that agenda. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the regulatory requirements, but I do have everything linked. So if you want more information on each of these areas, there are resources at the end of the presentation. So the regulatory requirements are really set in place through IDEA, which is the Federal Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. And we're currently working under the 2014 reauthorization. And they really set the stage for the 10-day rule, which we'll talk a little bit more about, manifestation determinations, services that have to be put in place during a suspension of a child with a disability, and then special circumstances. And as New York State always does, they take what the federal government has in place and those regulations develop our rules and regulations, and they always put more in place than what is required by the federal government. So we have some very similar things, but we also have some additional pieces through New York State Part 200 and Part 201 regulations. So the 10-day rule, again, that manifestation determination, they talk a lot about the results of the manifestation determination review. What is an interim alternative educational setting, which is similar to the services under the federal law, special conditions, and then New York State adds procedural safeguards. So we'll talk a little bit about what each of those mean for us. So the 10-day rule basically means there's a disciplinary change in placement is a suspension or removal from their current program or placement that's either 10 consecutive school days or a period of 10 consecutive school days or less if they're subjected to a series of suspensions that result in a pattern because they accumulate. And the big change in the last several, I'd say 4 years especially, has been that word pattern. There has always been in regulation that we should be doing pattern determinations before we go to a manifestation determination. So we're going to talk a little bit more about what does that mean and how that can be beneficial to us in a school. So we want to make sure that when we're making the decisions, we have really determined that pattern. I'll give an example. I had a kiddo that's had 5 days of suspension so far this year who's in an out of district placement. And the first 5 days, it was two separate 2.5-day suspensions for aggression. And then he brought a vape to school about 3 months later. That is not a pattern. When we looked at the two previous suspensions, they're very different. And so we determined, since it wasn't a pattern of behavior that created a disciplinary change in placement, that we really didn't need to have that manifestation determination meeting before a 5-day suspension for having a vape in school. So there are situations that if we document really well and go through the processes, they can make things a little bit easier for us. The interim alternative educational setting, or IAES, is in response to what I said was services under the federal law. In New York State, if we're putting students out of school, they have to be in an interim alternative educational placement, and they have to have their services given to them. So in larger districts and in more urban areas, often schools may have a tutoring center, or BOCES has an alternative to suspension location. I know right now in my region, which is in Western New York or Midwest region, Genesee Valley BOCES region, we don't have that option. So a lot of our kids are receiving their support in home as their interim alternative educational setting if we need to move to that. And that gives us time to provide their services while at the same time completing a functional behavioral assessment, changing behavior interventions, or looking for an appropriate placement if it's been determined that they're no longer appropriately placed. And we'll talk about how we get kids to those IAES settings as we're moving through the procedures. And then manifestation, the general requirement for a review is that we're looking to see if there's a relationship between the student's disability and the behavior subject to the action is a manifestation. So is there a relationship that's substantial between the disability and the behavior that occurs? And we have to do it immediately if possible, but in no case later than 10 school days after the decision is made to place a child in an IAES, or an impartial hearing officer has placed the student in an IAES, or we're doing longer than a 10-day suspension. So it has to be a pretty quick turnaround. I know most districts do the manifestation determination and superintendent's hearing in conjunction with one another if it is going to a superintendent's hearing, but we do have that no more than 10 school days. In our region, our legal representation has also said they would like us to go right into a CSE meeting after the manifestation meeting to determine whether any changes need to be made to the IEP based on whatever discipline decision is made. That can be a little trickier, but we're trying to do that. So we go right into determining, are we recommending a functional behavioral assessment? Are we recommending a change in placement, and having those conversations? Because the manifestation determination team is not necessarily the same as the CSE. And then the conduct of the review, what we're looking for in that manifestation is, was it caused by or have a direct and substantial relationship to the student's disability, or was it because of the district's failure to implement the IEP? And those are the only two questions that the manifestation team considers. After that, the discussion around services and programs has to go into a CSE meeting. And the special circumstances are added, and they've become, I think, more pertinent with things that are happening more often in schools. But it's for an impartial hearing officer. We can request an expedited due process to have a child placed in an IAES. If we feel that it is not safe to have that child returned to the educational placement that they were in. This has become more frequently used because of threats. So a superintendent can make a 45-day IAES decision for drugs, for weapons, or for serious bodily injury. If the child makes a threat to the school but hasn't done anything, that is when we would go to that expedited impartial hearing and get a hearing officer to make that determination. That we don't have to have a disciplinary action to request this impartial hearing to have that determination made, but those seem to be the circumstances that districts are using this more so than in the past when students are making serious threats against a district. And I talked a little bit about the superintendent does have that authority when it's drugs, serious bodily injury, or a weapon. And the hard thing with serious bodily injury is there are sometimes differences in opinion on what that means. And in regulation, it really means disfigurement, serious injury that could have resulted in death. And we have teachers unions that are often saying, but they hit me. That is a serious bodily injury. And it doesn't always stand up if it goes to an impartial. So we have to be really careful. I always err on the side of caution and have a teacher who has been involved in any kind of injury to get them to be checked out by a medical doctor. So we have all of that documentation. So if the parent fights us on that, we have the medical documentation to back us up, because we don't want any of our staff being injured. But in order for us to have it hold up if a parent fights, we really have to have that medical documentation, because just a picture of bruising or saying that the teacher had concussion-like symptoms without that medical causes districts to lose in the hearing if without that documentation. So we always err on the side of caution and encourage our staff to get checked out by a medical provider, not just our school nurse. So that's a lot. That's the regulatory piece. So I know there's a lot of information. If anyone has a question, you can either type it in the chat quickly, or we can unmute and let you ask a question here. I think we'll get into the meat of what to do with some of this information, but do you have any questions just about the regulatory background?
And we'd also welcome people at any time to put up in the chat, why you chose to register for this workshop today. What is perhaps, what are you experiencing? What kind of questions, as you said, as Lynn said, might you have? Or if anyone wants to kind of share just a general kind of situation that did cause, confusion and frustration with regard to disciplinary consequences, feel free.
All right, so I gave some wait time there. We'll start digging into a little bit more of the practical now, and I hope we have more conversation and questions as we move into this. So the first piece is really that prevention piece. And so we really want to have solid positive behavior interventions for all students. So that school-wide system of support, and I would say even our tiered system of support where we're teaching our tier one kid, all kiddos, our behavioral expectations and appropriateness, and then moving into that tier two for those kiddos that need the smaller group, and then tier three for the students who may need more individual or more explicit instruction on appropriate behavior. I often share about 40 years ago, there was a study on vocabulary done that looked at how parents talk to their kiddos in the grocery store. And about 8 years ago, a group was going to replicate that study, and they were watching families interact at McDonald's. And they were unable to replicate the study because what they found was most often across socioeconomic statuses, the only time parents were interacting with their children in McDonald's was when they were misbehaving because of cell phones. And so it really has changed. And so I think we're seeing that more and more with our little ones. Our pre-K and K kiddos are coming to school and they've almost learned a different behavioral language than they might have learned 15 or 20 years ago. So the people that are most trusted in their lives are the people they interact with the most. To get their attention, they have to be naughty. And so we're seeing some of that come into our pre-K and kindergarten classrooms. And so that instruction has become more and more important. Some of the interactions, sharing, having a conversation with someone else, waiting, is very challenging. So the more prevention and instruction we can do ahead of time, the better it is. And then the next piece, the de-escalation piece, is really a requirement that came about when the state did update the regulations around timeout and restraint and seclusion. And so one of the requirements that is for all staff is training on de-escalation when students are experiencing behaviors. And then additional training needed for any staff who may need to restrain. And they took away what they used to be called that emergency restraint. They don't want people putting hands on students to break up fights, things like that, that administrators used to have as an emergency intervention. The state really removed that and said, no, anybody who puts hands on kids should have training, and we only should be doing it if there is risk of serious injury to themselves, to someone, or to someone else. So it took away if kids are trashing a classroom, we really shouldn't be putting our hands on them, and put a lot more restrictions with a huge emphasis on training. And when this hit districts, and I don't know if you're all challenged as we are with this, it was, how are we going to do that? Because a lot of districts were using therapeutic crisis intervention, which is a 4-day training. How do we get that to all staff? We don't have subs. We don't have release time. How do we get the training that is required so that staff are prepared? And so I think we're working through that. I know Vector, who does a lot of our trainings for the mandatory training on all of the other pieces like sexual harassment and airborne pathogens, they've added a short de-escalation training that we do get to all staff. And we're really working on ways to get more in-depth training to everyone. And so looking at other systems, we're using Crisis Prevention Institute now instead of therapeutic crisis intervention because they have a shorter training that is just on prevention and de-escalation. And then they also do go into restraint training. But the prevention piece is much stronger than what was in therapeutic crisis intervention. So we're trying different things to get that training to all staff. And that has helped our staff feel more comfortable with some of the new behaviors that we're seeing that in the past may have been the students may have been in alternate settings. We're seeing more and more of our students remaining in district because we don't have out of district placements. And I'm just looking because I saw a bunch of things popped up in the chat as I was talking about this. So elementary school, okay, and families. Okay, I just saw that de-escalation training. So I will talk a little bit about that. I do love the de-escalation training that Vector does. It's a half an hour and it's an overview, but it's really, really good for all staff. And it gives, we've done it with everyone, even our bus drivers, everyone in the district. So even our secretaries, because they often have parents who may be escalated. And so it's a quick 30-minute nice video instead of doing it the way we did sexual harassment and all of those other things. We had people watch it in small groups so they could have a conversation after. We did 3 guiding questions for the facilitator to run through with our small groups so that they could have a conversation about that. And then they brought notes back to the administrative team about what, other things that they were asking so we could look into more training. I do really like the de-escalation training that the Crisis Prevention Institute provides, and they have several different options. So you can buy just video training, which is about a 2.5-hour training. We chose to send 2 administrators to become trainers. So they do have train the trainer programming, and then they allow you to use all of their videos, all of their PowerPoints, resources, and we can do that ongoing with shorter smaller numbers of people. And we've also used some outside trainers for de-escalation, but if others have suggestions that they have used, we're always looking to build on our professional development library. Go ahead. Oh, I heard someone talking, but so yes, the Vector was the first one. And again, we did for everyone, but we also use Crisis Prevention Institute. I have heard Handle with Care. I just got that in the chat that is also another great program. And it's, finding what works for your district. And sometimes it's having a menu of options so that you're meeting the needs of all of your staff as well. And then we're going to get to the other question about the wording. Does the conduct have a direct and substantial relationship to the student's disability? Refer to the classification. We'll talk a lot more about that. So we will go into detail. So hold tight and we'll get to that. And we just have another one, I haven't heard of this, so I'm jotting it down. UKERU, UKERU program. So I will look into that. And now we'll talk a little bit about functional behavioral assessments. So for those students whose behavior is persistent and that interferes with their learning or the learning of others, you really need to do an FBA. And I would encourage CSEs and districts to consider doing the FBA before it gets to those 10 days. So if you're starting to see a pattern where you're getting office referrals and the child's behavior is ramping up and you're even at 2 or 3 days of suspension or you're starting to consider more long-term, start that process early, because that can give more information, and be beneficial when or if you have to start discussing an alternate placement or an interim alternative education setting. So the sooner we do that when the behavior starts ramping up, I think the better it is. And this year has the first year that I have needed or been able to have a board certified behavior analyst as a member of our team that's completing the functional behavioral assessments. And I have to say, it's been an amazing addition to the multidisciplinary team. Her perspective is a little bit differently. She can frame things differently. She's brought new tools to us for determining different types of reinforcers for behaviors. She's very good at helping us determine where the skill deficit is versus, is this just a behavior or is this a deficit in skill that we really have to instruct the child on before we are putting those disciplinary consequences in place. And she's been super helpful in modeling alongside our teaching assistants and teachers and learning how to follow through with the behavior intervention plans. And because I know one of the hardest things is developing from that FBA, the behavior intervention plan. I think we're sometimes great at writing these amazing plans on paper, but it's not feasible for the teacher to implement. And then we know what happens. The teacher is overwhelmed and feeling guilty because they can't do all the things that we wrote in the plan. The child's behavior is not getting better. Parents are getting upset with us, and it creates this perfect storm. So she has really been helpful at saying, wait a minute, what can we put in place that's feasible for the teacher to implement and not overwhelming in the classroom, and that will get results. And so that has been a huge piece. So if you can afford a behavior analyst or just contract for the FBA help, it really has been an incredible professional development for all of us, for the administrators, the teachers, the teaching assistants, as she's been working alongside all of us to better support our students. So any questions at all or comments on the kind of prevention things you can put in place?
Lily, could you speak to the, I'm going to say it wrong, Ukiru program? Tell us a little bit about what you liked about it.
Yeah, sure, I can do that. It was a program when I was working at BOCES that we went through, and I really liked the de-escalation part of it. Talked a lot about the brain chemistry behind it, and really used a lot of videos and broke things down. I've done like TCIS, I've done NCI, I've done a lot of I've done SKIP, I've done a lot of the de-escalation things. And that one I felt like broke the information down to be understood by a wide variety of people who maybe didn't have experience with behavioral interventions that other people did, right? It was accessible to paraprofessionals, it was accessible to teachers. It's like 6 hour training as opposed to a couple days. And I don't know, I just really liked the way that they broke it down for people, the way that they described the behaviors and the different ways that they suggested de-escalating.
Thank you.
Absolutely. That's
Always good to hear about a new one. Someone else mentioned Noel, I think, Handle with Care. If anyone wants to chime in and comment on one of those trainings they've had, feel free.
Yeah, we used we sent our school social worker to become a trainer for our district in Handle with Care. And we felt like it was just much more comprehensive. It had a really robust de-escalation piece to it. And then we had some questions about, doing like a student transport and how does that, is that considered restraint or not? And the man that created the program came and did a Zoom call with us and went through all of those situations and gave us immediate feedback on what we were dealing with. So it was really useful.
Thank you.
great as well.
Raylan,
And
maybe you can clear up a little confusion in a question. If we scroll up, Sarah, Sarah had a question about the wording in the question. Does the conduct in question have a direct and substantial relationship to the student's disability? Does that refer to the child's classification, or do we take into consideration all diagnoses identified on the IEP? That sounds like a whole ball of wax.
Yep. And so in addition to the classification, you do look at the disability and we do look at diagnoses. However, for a while it was, so I'll use ADHD because it's a common diagnosis. Any child with ADHD is impulsive and inattentive and has all of the characteristics. And so people would say, parents especially would say, well, my child has ADHD and this was an impulsive behavior, so it's connected to their disability. What attorneys have shared is that that's not a completely accurate. So you can read the DSM-5 manual and it will list all of the symptoms that could be present in a child with ADHD. However, we need to look at the record of that child and what's in their IEP. So have they been impulsive? If nothing in their IEP talks about impulsive behavior, but talks only about inattention and needing redirection to task and not having minimizing distractions in the environment, things like that, then saying the behavior was caused by the disability may not be, or have a substantial relationship to that disability may not be correct. So you have to look at all of the information and the history of the child. So the better written the present levels of performance are, as well as the discipline referrals are specific, it's easier to determine if there is a connection or not. And sometimes there are advocates that will say, no, they have this diagnosis, impulsivity is a characteristic of it. But if they have no history and they've been classified for 6 years and this is the first behavior, that probably isn't a direct and substantial relationship. So in talking with the attorneys, they're saying they could, I guess, take that to a hearing and have that stand up as a decision, as long as we've considered all of the information. Does that answer your question? And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move through the slides as well.
Thank you, Lynn.
Yes,
Just a
thank
couple of
you.
things to maybe touch upon whenever you get to them. Approaches helpful in teaching staff how to understand the function of behaviors, and sensory room versus timeout room. So maybe we'll touch on those at some point.
So
Thank you.
I'll talk a little bit about that. I don't have that in my slides, but I do have some information in resources about that. So I actually just had a meeting. Our New York case board meeting was in late March, and Chris Siriano, who is the Associate Commissioner for Special Education, came to our meeting. He comes once a quarter to talk with us, and that he clarified again for us that a sensory room is not considered timeout. So basically, a timeout room is only considered timeout if a child is removed specifically for the behavior that's occurring as a way to stop the behavior. So if we have sensory breaks or a sensory room, walks, wagon rides, any of those types of things that are part of their plan to help them regulate, they are not considered timeout. The only time it's considered a timeout room is if it's used in direct response to the behavior that's occurring at that moment. So that is really, really helpful for us when you're thinking about that. We often have, especially on our littles with that are on the autism spectrum, we build in those sensory breaks or time in the sensory room, and it's to help them regulate. It's not necessarily as a disciplinary response. So that would not be considered time out. And that was coming directly from Chris Siriano, which is helpful when they clarify things like that. the other piece, and this is in response to the question before, what about outside evaluations, therapist notes on behavior? That can be considered. We have to consider outside notes. I have not had very many outside therapists that are willing to share notes with us because of the confidentiality, but outside evaluations we do have to take into consideration. But again, those present levels of performance, as well as the detail in the discipline notes and data, becomes really important. So if it's a one-off behavior that's never occurred before, that's harder to say that it's a direct and substantial relationship to the disability. But yes, you consider all of those things. And part of, as we get into the forms, I'll show you, we do consider information from the parent is one of the things that the manifestation determination review team has to consider. And we have had parents request that an outside therapist join them at those sessions as well. So any follow-ups on the timeout room? All right. It makes me feel a lot better about what we do for our kiddos to support them. And because there was a big fear when that the new regulations came out that we weren't going to be able to use all of the supports that we had in place for our kiddos. And we'll talk a little bit about the functions of teaching staff about the functions of behavior. I do have some resources that I will share with you on that. So now we'll move into some processes. So before we get into the need for suspension, and we really should talk about how do we implement instruction and or counseling to ensure that it's not a skill deficit that's leading to the behavior, or that function of the behavior is the function due to the child not having the skills. And so it's becoming more and more critical that we have those tier 1 social emotional learning curriculum, really building that into preschool. We're doing a lot of talk in our region about what people are using here for our instruction for our little ones. I know Second Step is one that's very popular, but we're exploring lots of different options, as well as options that support our staff in understanding their own behavior, their own reactions to behavior, their own triggers. So I just have another one that popped up. See the Good is an excellent tier 1 program. Some strength-based learning is awesome. We also have the Leader in Me, some of our districts are using, but that's more of the character ed versus the instruction in behavior. So we're seeing districts kind of combining different programs to hit both sides of that. And then for the kiddos that aren't responding to that, what are the next levels? So using, I love the social thinking curriculum for our kiddos on the autism spectrum. Zones of regulation that just popped up. That's another great one for, it's good for all kids, but especially our kiddos that are really struggling to regulate and need even more explicit than our tier 1 sometimes does. So sharing those programs, if you have ideas, because I think everyone's in the same boat right now of trying to find what will work for the kiddos that we have walking through our doors right now. And then being proactive with our FBAs and BIPs, like I talked about, like don't wait until we have to do it, but once we see those patterns starting to really dig into it, communicating regularly with the family. This is a double-edged sword, because I know some families are very, can be difficult to work with, or we see some negative reactions. So we want to make sure that we're not only communicating when there are struggles, but also having them part of our problem-solving teams. That is another piece that our board certified behavior analyst has really done. She has specific interviews that she does with families to gain their information in helping us develop plans, and even having them be part of the rewards or the positive parts of the plan so that they're not just hearing from us when their child is struggling. And I know, and I say this to my staff, I lived it as a mom. My oldest son has autism, and I often say he taught me more than any class I ever could have taken. And the biggest thing was he taught me what it feels like to sit on the other side of the table, because I was already a special ed teacher before he was diagnosed. And I had been in a lot of CSE meetings and couldn't always understand why there was so much emotion. And if Andrew taught me nothing else, he taught me that you cannot be subjective when it's your own child. The emotion that's tied to that love of your life is hard to separate. And often I think the reaction we get from parents isn't really about us. It's about the grief and the fear and the unknown and all of that that goes into living with and loving a child with a disability. And so when a parent yells at me or cries at a meeting or apologizes for becoming upset, I often say, you never have to apologize for advocating for your child. I don't allow them to be disrespectful, but I understand where they're coming from. And I think that's super important that we frame everything like we're in this, all in this, to do what's best for your child. And our goal is for your child to be successful. So whatever plan we put in place or whatever program we recommend, it is because we want the same things you want. And so I think building those partnerships is one of the best things that we can do. And it's probably one of the hardest things that we do, especially, and I look at my building leaders who are doing a million things. And you have teachers coming at you and kids in your office waiting, and you have parent calling you at you yelling about something that happened, or and then the PTO president wants to talk about, and so there are all of those things. One of my very first director of special education when I was a special ed teacher, Ed Kirkoven, who I admire so much, when I was trying to make a decision about a little guy with Down syndrome, he said, Raylin, whatever decision you make, think about how you would feel if you were his parent. And I always keep that in the back of my mind. And I have some parents that when they pop up on my phone, I know at that moment I'm not ready to handle that. So I let it go to voicemail, collect myself, and call them back when I'm in a good place, because if there's 20 other things going on, I might react differently. And so I think as a young administrator, I think having a person that I could go vent to before I made the phone call home when I knew I was triggered or the parent said something really rude to me was super, super important. And it's okay. And I have a young building principal that in our district right now that I have shared with him on multiple times. You don't have to call them back immediately. You can wait 20 minutes, take a breath, do a lap around the building, be in a good headspace before you make that phone call so that you don't react to them. And I think having those critical partners where you can call, have the conversation with, calm down, and then respond, it goes a long way. And also being there to protect our teachers. I had a mom who, no matter what, it went from 0 to 100. One time she called, and it's funny now, but she left a voicemail, which she always did. I asked her to call me before she called teachers when she was upset. And it was laced with the F words and this, and it's an emergency, and she needed an immediate call back. And I happened to be out after a medical procedure and had to have taken pain medication. So I decided it wasn't good for me to call back, and I forwarded it to my superintendent. And he texted me about 20 minutes later, and he said all of that swearing and yelling was because the teacher had scanned in a PDF upside down and she didn't know how to turn it around. So in her mind, everything was an emergency. And so protecting her, she always called, she swore, she screamed on the voicemail. If we waited 10 minutes and call her back, you could have a great conversation. But to a teacher, that was very demoralizing to have those voicemails or have that parent scream at them. So I think that family is really important to navigate. have those people you can talk to, know your own triggers, but also understand that they have that grieving process that they're going through as well. So looking at environmental factors, is it that they're too close to the heater and the noise is driving them crazy? Or are they sitting behind a student that drives them crazy because they move too much? Thinking about those things. And then really ensuring, and I know building leaders don't have as much to say in this, but I have started inviting my building leaders to some of our more challenging kids because you do have some insight, but making sure that the IEP, the present levels accurately depict the typical behaviors that we see from the child so that we're really, really documenting and everyone's voice is shown there so that if we get to a manifestation, we really have what we need. And then once the suspension occurs, the paperwork is huge. That can derail an entire process if a parent goes to the hearing. So making sure the Part 100 letters that the principals are the best at, making sure you have the letter that's the proposed suspension that offers that informal conference. And then once that conference has happened or they've declined, then the formal letter of suspension. Plan for reentry. I think we skip that step sometime. I always like to have a meeting with the parents and the child before they reenter. And if there needs to be some restitution or some relationship repairing before that, sometimes it's the teacher that's involved. So the teacher, the child can have a conversation before they're just thrown back in the classroom. That could be with an administrator. Sometimes it's the principal, sometimes it's me, sometimes it's our school counselor. But that reentry plan can really help both the child and the teacher as they're coming back into the classroom. Sometimes we've even done a reentry plan where we do a circle with the class before the child returns to the class so that the kids can talk about if there is fear or, how do they interact with, making sure we make it safe for everybody with that reentry plan. And then having those conversations do we need to make a change? Does the BIP need to change? Does the IEP need to change? Do we need to have an FBA, all of those things. And again, ensuring that that IEP is updated if needed. And then next in our processes, I'm going to continue here. The pattern determination is super important. So that's another process, really looking at behaviors that are occurring before you get to 10 days. So if you're at 6 or 7 and you're seeing these continue, sit down with a team. They recommend that it's someone from special ed, the teacher, a building administrator, look at the referrals and start talking about, is this a pattern of behaviors that is going to lead to a disciplinary change in placement? Or if they look more like just random things that are happening and it's not a pattern, is there something else we need to put in place? If it is a pattern, what are we going to do to stop the pattern? So is it more instruction? Is it adding counseling? Is it a skills group? What else can we do? And then if you get to 10 days, that pattern determination has to be documented. So document who was part of the conversation, what information did you look at? If it's found to be a pattern, you schedule the manifestation. If it's not a pattern, you can impose the suspension without that. The manifestation, again, is not based just on diagnosis or classification, but how that diagnosis or classification is manifested by the student in question. So it's not just read the DSM-5 and this, because this child has this, it must be. It's what do we know about this child and how this classification or diagnosis impacts them. And I say this often, you can line up 25 kids with autism or 25 kids with ADHD or 25 kids with ODD, and they all look different. So they're kids first, and we have to be thinking about that child, not just the diagnosis or the classification. So any questions on the processes piece? And feel free to type or unmute and ask.
Hi, Raylan. I do have a question.
All right.
Hi, my name is Kelly Zelke. So one of the questions I think I have around the pattern determination and the manifestation, and I typed this in earlier too, so it's one of those longer ones, is that so we're in a secondary building. So because it needs to happen before the suspension, I think the frustrating thing that we have sometimes is that kids will then end up just right back in class until we can do that process. And is that accurate? And is there, I guess, does anyone have any advice on how to redo that? And how does that, I guess, also look with the 24-hour notice piece? So we have to give parents 24 hours notice before the manifestation. So sometimes we're waiting upwards of almost 2 days before a consequence for behavior that should not be happening in a classroom, and we send them right back to class.
Right. And so there has been mixed guidance on this from different RAs across the state. So my understanding, and again, I'm not an attorney, is that we can't impose the suspension until the parents have had an opportunity to have the informal conference, but they can be out of the building while we're going through the manifestation process. If it was a manifestation, those days get erased from their record. So we try to do it pretty quickly, but the pattern determination, I would say that pattern determination, you could get a small team together and do that while you're waiting for the parents. And if it's not a pattern, then you don't even have to worry about a manifestation. So that I did have the mom that I talked about where it was fighting and then a vape. And we said, there's no pattern. We're not going to manifestation. She did question that. And I very clearly just showed her the regulation is pretty clear about the pattern determination, and it has to be a pattern of behavior. So I would clarify that with your attorney because, like I said, different RAs are giving different advice on that. And we've had some in our region advice given that you should go immediately to avoid a superintendent's hearing and the manifestation. They're saying they could do an agreement in lieu of, and that some of the special ed attorneys are having an issue with that, but we've had some districts do agreements in lieu of a superintendent's hearing. So the parent will agree to 15 days or whatever it is. And so that has happened quite a few times. But again, I would check with your attorney just to be sure. And then can you have a manifestation prior to 10 days? You can. I would do the pattern determination first, definitely before 10. So if you're doing a day here, a day and a half here, a day and a half there, you can have that pattern determination anytime, and that can help you change practices or put more supports in place. And you can do a manifestation before 10 days. But you have to do it at 10 days.
Right. And then if we do one, say at like 8 or 9 days, and then another infraction occurs, we have to do another one. Right. So every time an infraction occurs, then after the 10 days, you have to do one.
You have to do a pattern determination to determine if a
Right.
manifestation is
Right.
needed. Yep. And then the informal conference, we have a question about that. So in one district, we really push the students to come in and have them meeting in person, and in others, it can be held over the phone. We try to get the parents to come in person. However, with parent schedules and work and all of that, we are flexible. Often the parent will come in because they'll have the informal and then take their child home. So that's sometimes how we get them there. But we have some parents who don't respond at all and just completely waive the informal conference, whether it's in person or over the phone. I think that really depends more on your district policies and procedures than regulatory requirements. It doesn't say necessarily that it has to be in person.
Hi, this is Honeywell. I got Stacy Talon over here, Director of PPS.
Hi, Stacy.
Hi, and
How are
I'm the
you?
assistant principal who does a lot with the discipline. So we have a very specific scenario, and this is a real scenario here. So we have a student who's identified their BIP target behavior specifically as physical contact with students and staff. So we know that there's a pattern and there's a history of physical contact with students and staff. So ahead of time, we're talking, there's this pattern. We know the pattern exists. The student is at 9 days of suspension for the year. And then the student shoves a teacher again, goes down a line and shoves like 15 students without stopping. Right. That student then looks to be suspended, and with a progressive discipline model, that suspension would carry beyond the 10 days. So the specific question is, knowing that there's the pattern of determination, knowing that there's a connection to the disability, but also knowing the substantial disruption of the learning environment and the physical contact, where do you see the regulations interpreting that?
So I would say this would be a case. So under those special circumstances, where is it safe to have that child in the building? So is that where you would go to an expedited impartial hearing for an interim alternative education setting for this student, which would give you 45 days then to look for an alternate placement. So is the placement appropriate, I guess, is the CSE could make that determination, but while you're doing all of those things, it may be time, depending on the age of the child and all of that, is it safe for him to be in the building? If you determine it's not, then I would look at that IAES as an alternative while you're trying to put other things in place for this child. Does that answer? Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, please.
So the student is at, we have the students at 10 days. He's going to go to 11. It was my understanding that we cannot suspend him past 10 days until we have that manifestation, because we need to determine if it's a manifestation or not. And if it is, then he can't get suspended. If it's not, then he can go ahead and get suspended.
So in the special circumstances in the regs, and I'm going to go back up for, if you feel that the child, there's a likely to result in an injury to the student or to other students, you don't have to commence any disciplinary action to ask for them to be put in an interim alternative education setting. And that's in the regs. So you would just call an impartial hearing officer, get that, and they can place them without any discipline happening for if it's not safe for them to be there. Because you're having that as part of the BIP. I mean, it's automatically going to be a manifestation, but then it comes back to he's not safe to be in the building right now. And then you can go through, is this an appropriate placement? Are we looking CSE wise to make a recommendation to something else? Or do we need to go in more detail on the behavior intervention plan?
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Raylin.
You're very welcome. And we can talk more. You can shoot me an email, Stace, if you would like outside of this too. That's been used more frequently because our kiddos, and I said this earlier to Karen, we're in a perfect storm right now because we have lack of providers, which is leading to lack of placements outside of our districts, and we have an increase in the behaviors, and so we're also keeping kiddos that would have been in alternate placements before. So it's adding to everyone's plates, and so I think it's the first time in some of our districts that we're having to look this deeply into the regulations because we had so many other options before.
And a major increase in the behaviors at much younger grade levels.
Absolutely. Yes, in the MDR, so the last question I have here, would you meet as the manifestation determination team? You determine if it's a manifestation. Kicking it back to the CSE is then the CSE has to determine if it's an appropriate placement. So that's why our attorneys in our region are recommending you go from the manifestation team into a CSE meeting, because technically the manifestation team can't determine if the placement is appropriate. The CSE has to do that. And they're two separate committees. And we've had that clarified a couple of times by legal, because it used to be on some of the manifestation forms that were going around that is the placement appropriate, but really it has to be the CSE that determines that. All right, so we talked a little bit about paperwork. So pattern determination, so paperwork, all the part 100s, which are all the letters that the principals are usually much better at than the special ed directors. So I rely on my principals for all the notifications there. Then part 200 is there are some specific pieces there. So we have to provide the prior written notice of a manifestation meeting. We also have to provide a copy of the procedural safeguards, which I do have linked later. And that's sometimes something people forget when we're going to manifestation, include the procedural safeguards with that notice. And then every time after that, we still have to give that procedural safeguards notice. For pattern determinations, these are some questions, and I do have a form that you will get after this presentation. There we go. So we want to review the referral record, and will the current suspension result in the student being removed for more than 10 days in the current school year? If yes, you go on to step 2. Is the behavior that resulted in the current suspensions substantially similar to the previous behaviors? This is where I will caution against using things like insubordination or disrespect or those types of things in referrals. Be very clear, what did they do, so that you can determine if it's similar or not. And does it serve the same function as the behavior in the previous incidents? So when I talk about the fighting versus bringing a vape to school, they're very different, and that was easy. Some of the other behaviors are a little more challenging when you get to the pattern determinations. So you have those questions, and then moving into, is it similar suspensions and removal lengths? Are they close in proximity? Behaviors leading to the suspensions occurring at similar times, similar locations, other factors that would make it a pattern. So you use questions 1 and 2 to then answer, did it exist or did it not exist? So if there is no pattern, you don't need to have an MDR. You don't have to determine manifestation. The disciplinary consequences can continue. If there is a pattern, then you go into that manifestation determination meeting. And then you have to do that pattern determination for every subsequent suspension for the rest of the school year.
Lynn, I just want to answer a question that came up that has double exclamation points and a heart. And the question is, will this presentation be shared after the meeting? The answer is yes, it will. The recording of this presentation will be shared on the SANES website under professional learning, and the wonderful resources, including the slides and links that Lynn shared, will also be with the recording on the SANES website. So give us a day or 2 to get it up there, but it will be up there. I hope that answered your questions. Thank you.
All right. And then the special circumstances we talked about. So a controlled substance or drug, any substance that's under the schedules. So it's, in schools, alcohol, tobacco, any drug, controlled substance is listed there. Serious bodily injury, and this is what can get us in trouble, which involves a substantial risk of death, extreme physical pain, protracted and obvious disfigurement, or loss or impairment of the function of a bodily member, organ, or mental faculty. We have I've successfully argued that a severe concussion is a serious bodily injury. But again, having that medical documentation is really important here. Some parent attorneys will argue that if it didn't include a hospital stay, that it's not a serious bodily injury, but all of us know that with current insurance, you don't always get to stay in the hospital. But a severe concussion, it would be or a broken bone. I had a broken nose in one situation that could be considered a serious bodily injury. And then weapons are any weapon, device, instrument, material, substance, animate or inanimate, that could be used for or readily capable of causing death or serious bodily injuries. It does not include a pocket knife with a blade of less than 2½ inches. So we've had questions in other presentations. What about a pipe? Like if a child is trying to hit someone with a pipe, and the attorney response was yes. In some commissioner's decisions and in court cases in other states, a pipe that a child, and it depends on the size of the child using it as well. So if you have a 5-year-old, it may not be as dangerous as an 18-year-old. So it depends on the circumstances, but whatever they have could be considered a weapon if it could cause serious harm to someone. And that's when the superintendent can put a child in a 45-day IAS. You don't need any outside hearing officer for that. The superintendent can make that decision. And then partnerships. So this is really important, and I've been super lucky in the positions that I've worked in to have really good relationships with my building leaders. And I think having that building team, including the teachers, special educators, related service providers, mental health support, and administrators, as well as parents, as partners when we're dealing with these behaviors before they get to the level of needing to go to manifestation. But your special ed administrators are also really important because sometimes we have other resources or another network to reach out to when we have some of these situations that are one-offs that we've never dealt with before. It's good for the principals to have their principals groups, but I know on our listserv, just in the Genesee Valley region, we have questions at least 3 or 4 times a week where we can reach out to each other as special education administrators talking about how to solve different problems. So rely on those partnerships. And like I said earlier, those parents have to be partners. And I think some of our most challenging parents are the ones we need the most to partner with us. So building those relationships becomes super important. So I'm going to share some of the resources that I have so that you can see them. And again, most of the links work. The reason we'll also get the template separate because I linked them, but for some reason the links aren't working. So you will get those separate as attachments. But the Part 200 regulations are available on the SpEd website, and those are specific just to behavior. I'm clicking on a couple here. The behavioral supports and intervention and discipline procedures with students with disabilities is a really nice page. The Office of Special Education has been working really hard to update its website, and so they are providing more resources. So the most recent one is about procedures and protocols to prevent elopement and wandering. Their FBA policy brief, which I will show you because these are actually really nicely done and they're quick, easy. You know, what is it? What must it include? A one-pager that you can use as a conversation starter if you're writing, developing forms or policies around FBAs. Let me go back to that. The other piece I love here, and I have this on my wall, I've given it to all of my principals, is the manifestation determination flow chart. So it's really nice just to know these are the steps that we have to take. This is the prior notice, the procedural safeguards are linked right there. And it's, again, it's a one pager that's really nice to have. This resource is actually from the federal government, if it will open. This is creating and sustaining discipline policies that support the social, emotional, behavioral, and academic well-being. And it's a resource for schools and district leaders. So there are lots of resources in this document. I don't always love everything that comes out of the Department of Education because sometimes it's too theoretical, but it is a really nice, it's not terribly long. It's only 7 pages. I linked those. We looked at the policy briefs are very quick and easy to use. All of the information on restraint and seclusion that came out from SpEd is available. This is why we presented, or why New York State responded. So the U.S. Department of Education did a resource document and a Dear Colleague memo. And so New York changed their regulations based on this document. And then after all of the regulations came out and the uproar about timeout rooms, restraint, seclusion, all of that, NYSED did put out a Q&A. So there is a Q&A in response to the behavioral supports and interventions in school amendments that took place in August of 23, that gets updated pretty regularly. The last update was April of 24 or December of 24. So it keeps getting updated as questions come in. But this is also, it does have some information on timeout rooms specific to what is a timeout room. There's a question about whether or not a sensory activities. So there is an answer to that question that you asked here as well. The use of a calming space or room containing coping tools or activities is not a timeout room. So that's in writing as well. So if you need that for colleagues, it's there. And then I also have my templates, again, that will be in a separate email to you. So any other questions? I know it's a lot in a really short amount of time, and this is a huge need right now. So any other questions or scenarios that people want to work through with the number of colleagues that we have on this call?
And if we missed one of your questions in the chat, just unmute right now and share it with us.
I just wanted to follow up on one of the questions I put in the chat. So if a student has had a manifestation at day 10 and they continue to be suspended, does the clock start over, or do they need to continue to have a manifestation meeting for every time that they're suspended?
Yep, every time they're suspended, we have to do that manifestation. And so if it continues, the real question would be, are they in an appropriate placement? Is there something we need to change on their IEP? But yes, they have to have a manifestation with every subsequent suspension.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Good day. I had a question in regards to the presentation. Will it be available to non-members? Do you have to be a member to have access to your website since the presentation is going to be generated there?
I'm going to ask Michelle Hebert to correct me if I'm incorrect, but I believe that you do not have to be a member to have access to the materials on the SANES website.
That is correct.
Thank you.
But
it's
just so great to be a member. And
okay.
$40. you can get a low-level membership that includes lots of benefits with regard to professional learning. So maybe something, everybody wants to check out once in a while. It's really good.
Good to know. So that's $40 annually or one time?
Yes. Yep.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And I will put a plug in. We've had this partnership between SANES and NICASE for the last year and a half. And if you're a director of special ed, NICASE is a great resource as well. But the partnership, I think, is super important because we often work in silos. And so it's been amazing to meet some gen ed administrators and be part of this because so much of our work overlaps. So SANES is wonderful to be a member of. And if you want just special education, NICASE is wonderful, but the partnership has been just great.
You bet. I mean, this is the way, things should be. And like I said, there's such a need right now. We have so many newer administrators getting into positions, and we don't come into our roles knowing this. And very often there's not training at some deliberate level, at least when we first need it. So we have found that these collaborations with NICASE and our special educator members, who are now, many of our presenters, is really very valuable and very appreciated. So we hope to kind of keep that up. And anyone who is here today, please never hesitate to send me an email, kbronson@sanes.org, with a suggestion for something you would like to see, a topic that you would like more on. And we will certainly follow up on that.
And we do have one question, that out of district placements. I should have added that as a partnership. Sarah asked, have anyone had experiences with out of district placements, suspending students and not communicating this in a timely manner and going over 10 days without your knowledge? I have. And honestly, we got into a situation because the principal of the out of district placement didn't even give the proper notification to families or anything. So there were a lot of issues there. So building communication protocols and reaching out to the administrators in those programs to kind of lay out what your expectations are, I think is really important. And I know it takes time, but it can save a lot of headache. And I usually just send a letter introducing myself as the director, how they can get in contact with my secretary to have that information, so that if we ever get into a place where they're suspending, that they know what my expectation is. So that is a great question. And I'm sorry I didn't include that in my original presentation, but that should be part of the partnership. But a brief communication protocol so that you both know, like, this is what I'll communicate with you, this is what I expect you communicate with me, helps try to avoid that. It doesn't mean it will never happen, but being proactive, I think, is really important.
Thank you. You know what? I find that on a lot of our topics, whether they're the power hours or series like this, we come around to the big idea, which is communication really makes the world go round. It really does. And it's especially true with everything related to student behavior, whether it's student with special education needs or not. Those small steps of communication and relationship building with parents are critical. I really was very moved by what you said, Lynn, because I had the similar experience. It really was by virtue of my daughter, who is now in her 40s with a lovely family, that, she was a special education student with an IEP for speech and all kinds of things. And until I was a special ed parent, I just didn't get it, what it felt like to sit in that little chair on the other side of the table. And it really was transformative because you never see the parents at those meetings the same way after you have that experience. And it just builds in tremendous understanding and respect for what parents come to those meetings with. What looks like anger or something else is really most of the time fear and vulnerability and frustration. And it is really just valuable to kind of keep that in mind, remind our teachers of that too, some of whom are parents of special education students themselves. And also, you know, the resources and the information that Lynn shared today. I know one of the early questions was, how do we get our teachers to have a better, you know, understanding of all this? And we want teachers to understand the constraints we're under too. We want them to understand that, and they don't know this stuff, right? They're not really formally trained in a lot of these regulations and things like that. So sharing some of these materials to build their learning and awareness of the situation, as it were, to kind of fill that in a little bit is really helpful. I mean, I think teachers and everybody really, really appreciate that, and they feel, I think, better when they at least know more, whether they agree with something or not, have a better understanding of why is it this way. Because there is really a lot of frustration out there, and as school leaders, we get caught right smack in the target middle of it. So the more we communicate all the way around, the better.
And someone had asked earlier about how to teach our teachers about functions of behavior, and I said I would get back to it, and I didn't. So I'm sharing my screen again. If you don't know about the New York State Ed Department Office of Special Education Educational Partnerships, they are housed at about BOCES across the state. You can go to their website, and I put it in the chat. I want to get to learn more. It's not going. Every region has one, and each region has the list of regional events that happen, but they do have training. I'm just going to go to Midwest because it's my region. It's at Monroe One BOCES. They have resources and events that to support all of this. So there are, for professionals, there are special ed process. For families, they do academics, behavior, function-based thinking is one of the trainings that they do at the partnership. So all of their trainings are free, and they occur across the state. And some of them are in person. They're, because of the difficulty getting subs, they have are also doing some that are asynchronous online with just a 1 hour synchronous session for questions and things like that. So they are also a really good resource. And it will tell you when you go to your region when the sessions are, but also who it's appropriate for. So there are some that are just for administrators, others that are appropriate for teachers and paras. But they do have some really nice resources there. They also have some of their resources online, so you can just look through the resources and guides that they have. So if you have questions about manifestation, they have a PowerPoint on that you can look at. But they're another huge resource. Their partner in this, if you look at their website, so it's an educational partnership, the regional partnership centers. The other piece is called the FACE Center, which is the Family and Community Engagement Center. So when you look at that, they all have a preschool, early childhood family engagement center, and a school age family engagement center. For some of my parents who are really struggling, I refer them to these people. In my region, I've worked with these people. I know them really well because I used to be part of RSE Task, and some of them were there in that network when I was. But their goal is to teach parents how to better partner with schools. So they are another resource. So it's a great place for teachers, and that function-based learning is a really nice training. It's about 2.5 hours for teachers, but also for families who are looking for resources. So that's linked there. And again, it's across the whole state. So